FEMA is doing its job. But what about these residents hit by the flooding? Why do so few have flood insurance? Is it the job of the federal government to foot their bill? Joining me now from our bureau in New York City, founder and managing partner of Geltrude, certified public accountants, and professor of accounting at Montclair State University, Daniel Geltrude. Dan, this is a top 10 storm, Florence, one of the biggest in our nation's history, as the president pointed out. Yet most of the people affected by this storm, from what I'm hearing, do not have flood insurance. So they are underwater, literally, are apparently going to be, financially and philosophically and physically. Why? Why do so many few have flood insurance in this obvious flood zone?
Well, it's not necessarily, Graham, that they're in a flood zone. You know, when these flood maps are drawn up based upon history of 100 years or even 500 years of flooding, you may have a situation where you're in an area that's not supposed to flood. So if it doesn't fall into historically one of these floodplains and you have a mortgage, for example, the bank may not require you to have flood insurance because you don't have to have flood insurance. However, if you have a mortgage and if you're in a flood zone, you're going to be required, if you want the loan, to have flood insurance. So when you have a storm, top 10 storm, as you said before, rolling in, you're going to have a situation where people who don't normally wouldn't be subject to floodwaters are now subject to floodwaters. And here's the problem, is that your regular homeowner's insurance excludes floods. So if you don't have specific flood insurance, you're completely exposed and not covered at all.
So it sounds as though, and we've talked about this on this program earlier this week, it sounds as though what these folks in the real estate industry and in the banking industry, these flood zone maps that are drawn up, I believe, by the federal government and also looked at and amended, I believe, at the state level, and then they're put out there for everybody to use as a reference, that these flood zone maps are simply wrong and they need to be updated. Would you agree?
Well, weather patterns are changing, and you can make the whole argument about climate change, but clearly we're having different types of floods going on. We're also having more population around the water, so more people are exposed. So what's going to happen here is, after this storm is over, the federal government is going to come in and they're going to redraw these maps. And they're going to say, well, as a result of Hurricane Florence, you are now in a flood zone and you're going to be required to have flood insurance, of course, if you have a mortgage. And even if you don't, there's a lesson here, Graham. Whether you're in a flood zone or not, you should have flood insurance in place. And by the way, if you're not in a flood zone based upon these maps that are drawn out, flood insurance is very, very cheap. So when these storms happen, obviously, hindsight being 2020, you really need to have flood insurance. Everyone should have it.
Let's face it, your neighbor leaves the bathtub running and you have conjoining walls. You're going to have a flood and you're going to need that flood insurance. But I guess the bigger question here in the Carolinas is, are these areas that don't normally flood, or are people building in areas closer to flood zones? I guess the answer is probably a little bit of both, is what you're telling me. But the floodwaters, bottom line, are devastating and will be a major disruption. They already are, of course, but long-term disruption to people's lives, their homes, their jobs. Just going to the local grocery store is going to be quite a task.
Yes, it is. Look, the projections here from Moody's Analytics is that the cost of this storm economically is going to be in the vicinity of over $20 billion. That's a lot of money, and as we talked about, it puts it in the top 10 for costliest storms. Katrina being number one, that was over $200 billion. And what had affected people in this area where I am, in the greater New York metropolitan area, Superstorm Sandy, which hit over 5 years ago. I don't want to be the bearer of more bad news for these people in North Carolina, and I know they're getting immediate help, and President Trump and the federal government, they're doing everything that they possibly can. However, I can tell you, in my home state of New Jersey, there are still people and businesses recovering from Hurricane Sandy all these years later. So this is a very, very prolonged period of time to recovery. And unfortunately, there are businesses that never come back, Graham. And what's that mean? People lose their jobs. People lose their homes. If they don't have flood insurance, they literally walk away and leave their homes to the bank to take it back.
And let's not forget that even if you do have that flood insurance, there is many times, oftentimes, maybe all the time, a maximum payout. And that is something to consider as well. And so as we Americans build homes and buy homes in these flood zones that aren't flood zones, you know, maybe near oceans, near lakes, right by volcanoes, on an earthquake fault, these are things to always consider when purchasing a residence, that the bad news could be coming one day. Dan, thanks.